thank you very much for your interest in our briefing. My gratitude also goes to the Graduate Institute and to you personally, Mahmoud, for partnering with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we are today experiencing a level of unprecedented polarization since the end of the Cold War. Relations between Russia and the West have been steadily deteriorating, and the levels of mutual trust are at their lowest. It is therefore high time to resume the dialogue between the two leaders, particularly considering the global challenges that cannot be addressed successfully in a unilateral manner. I do believe that this summit presents an opportunity to resume a sober dialogue. In fact, those in Washington seeking dialogue are not stigmatized anymore in the way they were under the previous administration. In other words, the arrival of the Biden administration, even if there is no attempt to a reset, could give way to a more constructive dynamic to the relations. We need, however, to manage expectations. The confrontational environment will continue. President Biden himself has been quite tough on his position on Russia and his president so far, and President Putin not less so. However, if we can identify select issues for dialogue and cooperation where interests of the sides converge, this could be a valuable beginning that could be built upon thereafter. It is already a step forward that the New START treaty has been extended for 5 years since President Biden took office. This gives both countries the opportunity to talk about the format of future arms control negotiations that at some point could then again take place in Geneva, where most of the previous agreements were negotiated. In addition to deployed offensive nuclear weapons, there is a likelihood that the inclusion of non-deployed weapons, non-strategic weapons, and new strategic weapons such as hypersonic missiles will be on the table. This would reduce the risk of nuclear war and prevent the relaunch of a new nuclear arms race. If indeed the conversation about strategic stability is to be strengthened and institutionalized again, this could also send a positive signal to military risk reduction in Europe in the conventional field, to reinforce, to modernize confidence and security building measures, to increase transparency, and to prevent and better manage military accidents and incidents in the air, at sea, and on land. Indeed, there is clearly no interest on any side for a military escalation in Europe. So strategic stability in the region is an area of converging interests. I could think of several other issues that could fall into this category of converging interests. Non-proliferation, climate change, other environmental issues, the Arctic, but perhaps also the end of this consular war. Overall, there are quite a number of areas to restart the dialogue. But for a constructive dialogue to be established, there needs to be an enabling environment. This is challenging, given the fact that the sides are not used to talk to each other anymore. It is therefore important that, in the medium term, but not too far from now, an agreement on the red lines is found, red lines that must not be crossed. For Russia, the experience of the last visit to Moscow of EU High Representative Josep Borrell has shown that it will not tolerate interference in its internal affairs. And this despite of OSCE commitments to a comprehensive approach to security that would allow other participating states concern for the respect of commitments in the realm of the human dimension, that is, human rights, rule of law, democratic institutions. And respect for human rights and respect for territorial integrity of other states are indeed important to the Biden administration. The same is certainly true for the issue of cybersecurity, a key area where sides have not yet defined any red lines. Still, I would argue that the fact that this summit is taking place and that Presidents Biden and Putin will speak with each other is already a positive outcome. At the same time, it is definitely premature to expect a normalization of relations. My best guess would be a coexistence of dialogue and selective cooperation against the backdrop of a continued confrontation. The summit is also a clear indication that Geneva is on the map. It puts Geneva back at the center of international governance. The COVID crisis, with the presence of WHO in Geneva, had already contributed to this reminder. The summit reinforces, therefore, the image of international Geneva as the operational heart of the multilateral system with a unique power to convene. In a polarized environment, such as the one we are in today, there is an even stronger and clearer need for safe spaces. Locations where the non-like-minded can discuss, can exchange, and possibly build bridges. Geneva is an ideal place for this. If the two presidents agree on a format that allows to give an impulse to arms control negotiations, this could, for instance, also give impetus to the currently paralyzed Conference on Disarmament. On all other issues of global nature, be it the pandemic, climate crisis, terrorism, human rights, the solutions discussed within the multilateral framework of Geneva will progress if powerful countries put their leadership, their buy-in, and their resources at the service of the human security defended here in Geneva and by Switzerland. At the GCSP, we are ready to support these efforts by training future leaders and as well by making us available as a platform for inclusive dialogue. I'm very pleased to note that we have been planning a series of conversations on cooperative security before the announcement of the summit. It will start by the end of this month, and these discussions on cooperative security have now become even more relevant. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this fascinating presentation. You really put a lot of interesting points in your 8 minutes. Maybe just a short summary. You discussed the importance to manage the confrontation between the two powers. You also covered the what would be the converging interests between Russia and the US, which are the non-proliferation, climate change, strategic stability, of course, working together on the Arctic, and possibly the end of the consular war. Thank you very much. Also mentioning the question of red lines. This is something which is very important in the relations, and it will be interesting to see how they can be defined. And finally, on the role and the importance of Geneva as the location and the secure and safe platform for such dialogues, as well as GCSP, who offers a possibility of series of dialogues on cooperative security. Thank you so much for that. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn to Professor Mohamedou. Mahmoud, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure for the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies to partner with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. This is a natural cooperation, both in the Maison de la Paix and the House of Peace here in Geneva, and on the issues we work on. It's also a personal pleasure to team up with Ambassador Greminger today. I'm happy to offer some analytical comments following on what Thomas has just presented so aptly. to provide some context and maybe flag some of the issues that seem to me are important to keep in mind as we go towards this particularly important event in the next few weeks here in Geneva. I very much subscribe to what Thomas has already indicated. I do believe that it is a key moment in terms of the need for a sober encounter, the nature of an unprecedented moment in terms of the deterioration over the past couple of years in that relationship. But above and beyond those dynamics, I think we can say a few things in relation to the specific context in recent months and in recent years leading up to this moment. The first element that I see, and this goes under the theme of an event that is really marred by quite a few paradoxes as it is. The first one is that this is expected. This is a summit that to a large extent is normal. It's a normal kind of moment of diplomacy in that sense. But it is also slightly unexpected in the sense that it comes quite early in the Biden presidency. It comes less than 6 months into the presidency. It's nothing particularly problematic, but it is interesting and arresting in that sense that the US president sees the need to have the summit. Of course, we should keep in mind that this is in the context of the trip to Europe, which is a classic undertaking that takes place anytime that those American presidencies start. In fact, one of the sort of different tracks that we saw was President Trump's choice to start his visit in Saudi Arabia at the time and not in one of the classical European partners, United Kingdom or Germany or France and so on. So in that sense, it is arresting to see that this comes with a little bit of that momentum, I would say. It is also, however, possibly explained by the sense of the inevitability, I would say, of that summit, in the sense that we have felt in the campaign and subsequently to the campaign, almost a need for President Joe Biden to deliver a message to his Russian counterpart. He has been using those terms, has been speaking in that language, in the sense that there is kind of an expectation, almost an eagerness to be at that table to deliver in situ that message as it is. I think that from the position of the United States, there is the Biden context, the administration, the man, and there's the larger US context, which should never completely decouple in the sense that there is a wider repositioning of the United States, which has been going on for quite a few years for that matter. Even the terminology speaks to this desire to get back at the center. America is back. We've heard President Biden speak. Before that, we had Make America Great Again. Before that, we had Yes, We Can. There is kind of a series of a desire to replace the United States at the center of global politics at a time when politics are changing. One could see this as a diminishing of the US power. One could see this as a normal evolution of the system. It's a matter of assessment. Certainly, the world has been going beyond, I would say, the superpowers. And this applies to both Russia and to the United States as it is. It is a normalization of the power game in that sense. Thirdly, and importantly, the summit is a classic. As I said earlier, this is something that takes place regularly. It is important. I would say it is desirable. And certainly, I completely sign on the notion that Geneva is the natural enabling environment, as Thomas put it. And I would say the uniqueness of this niche, of this place, which has been designed almost in that sense, in terms of its orientation towards creating a space for that engagement, is absolutely necessary. And we should always celebrate that, the fact that Geneva is bringing people to that safe space, to that encounter, to those engagements. Let me add a few sort of side-by-side elements for each one of the two sides, since this is a meeting around a table and each one is coming with their predispositions, probably their expectations. For the United States, following on what I was saying, in many ways, any comeback of sorts, again, America is back. So we're working with the notion that the president himself delivered the very evening of his election, if you recall. any comeback goes through Russia. There is a certain inevitability to that relationship, given the importance of Russia, of course. But I would say, given actually the inevitability of the couple, of the US-Russian couple in that sense, these are major powers around the world. They have a say on quite a number of things, and therefore they have to somehow find their rhythm regardless of these tensions. That is important in that sense. There is specifically now to the Biden administration, as mentioned, a desire to respond to Russia. There is a frustration, there is an expectation. You could even say that it's been delayed in that sense. We saw that regularly in the debates with President Trump in the fall and subsequently. In fact, this has to be said in the context of very explicit statements made by President Biden, the ABC News interview, if you recall, back in March, when prompted by journalist George Stephanopoulos, he was answering in those terms that Russia will pay a price, that he needed to deliver a message. He was not so clear exactly on what the message was, but this what gives us an indication of an expectation. And I see this moment as the culmination of that dynamic. This is now the moment where that encounter will take place. The president spoke in terms very explicit about his belief in a face-to-face diplomacy, which I think is an important aspect of this. And we should link this to the large and long experience of President Joe Biden. This is not your average US diplomat. He has been on the Hill, has been in Washington for many, many decades. He is extremely experienced in that. And in fact, as vice president, we should recall, has been engaging internationally, even if those meetings tended to be more ceremonial, but he has a chance here to engage directly at the highest levels in that sense. But this comes now, and echoing what Thomas said earlier, at a key deterioration moment. So there is a sense that Russia needs somehow to be responded to. It's as if Russia has gotten under the skin of the United States over the past couple of years, and that needs to be somehow addressed. And so I think it's fundamentally this psychodynamic that President Biden brings to the table in relation to this. Maybe he will be more explicit in terms of expectations along the lines of some of the crises and tension points that have been mentioned. For Russia itself, it is on the defensive. It is on the defensive in the context of this particular context. Certainly, it might have gotten under the skin of the United States, as I said, but it had bet on the re-election of President Trump, and President Trump lost. So this puts Russia in a particular place where it has to deal with that reality now, and it has now to deal with the new US administration, which is quite clear in terms of what it wants to do. And certainly we are far away from the Helsinki summit, where President Trump was essentially very much sitting and moving very passively in relation to President Putin at that time. But that game is a game that President Putin plays well, this game of essentially managing the relationship with the United States. So he's also coming at that meeting with a sense of an inevitable encounter, but one in which he might have things to say as it is. For the Russian side, one added element will make this encounter more difficult, which is that the United States will have now Europe more on its side, certainly than in the Trump context, particularly as in the days leading up to this, we will see these encounters and these images, this reunion of sorts that will take place across a number of European capitals and with leaders as well. In terms of moving on to starting to wrap up, moving on in terms of now the overall event, I think we should, of course, as has been indicated, we should not have unrealistic or too high expectations because of what we've just seen. Both sides are coming at the table with a sense of stasis, right? There is this kind of tension that has been building. But in a way, when one observes historically diplomacy, this actually can be turned into a positive. That energy, which is negative, could become a positive energy in the room because it could be therefore precisely deflected at that moment, depending on how things play out and what particular issues. I should recall everyone that diplomacy is the art of the possible. And in that context, with two old hands, Putin is also an old hand at this game. Both of them will be able to sort of work in that context without necessarily needing much sort of advice from their advisors for that sense. There is a moment there which I could see potentially, back to my notion of a paradox, potentially a moment actually of de-escalation, because of the very nature of the encounter makes it that this is going to be an opportunity to not necessarily up the game, because it has been upped so much already, but de-escalate it. Two elements lead me to think that. One is that both actors are weak at home today, regardless of their positioning internationally. Russia is facing a lot of pressure politically, the recent issues with political opponents, the tension that has been building. We've seen some demonstrations in recent months. This is a different Russia than a few years back when President Putin was more in control. There's a sense there that that is not necessarily going to play so easily. In fact, we can expect the US side to raise issues such as the arrest of opponents, the Belarus situation, Ukraine, of course, the cyber attacks, on and on. On the side of the United States, it's facing one of its more divisive period in terms of social injustice. This is also something that President Biden has named in his message, in fact, as his priorities, along with the pandemic, dealing with racial injustice at home. And these issues make it that, in fact, both of them, I would say, have more their eyes on the domestic these days than on the international. But one can imagine some sort of understanding, agreements. This could play on the field of regional tensions, regional conflicts. Syria comes to mind, other aspects of that relationship more generally, as it were. So all in all, I would say an encounter which is, in fact, should be celebrated in the fact that diplomacy should always be celebrated. And in recent decades, it has lost more to military interventionism and tension and divisiveness. So I think this is coming, and this is coming to Geneva, which, as I said earlier, is absolutely an important and a positive dynamic. But I also have, I would not be surprised, to close on this, that we have some sort of grand generic statement, I would say, couched in very sort of wide terms, but underneath that and following that, more importantly, a period of de-escalation in which the two sides realize both their inevitability and potential collaboration on some of these aspects. But we shouldn't really hold our breath, as they say, in that sense. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Sasha.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, for your analytical comments. You gave us a lot of food for thought and for questions, I'm sure. You described the specific context of this summit. You put it really in perspective, as we put it in our title. You spoke about the Biden administration and its approaches in comparison with the Trump previous years and approaches to Russia. You also discussed what was the role of Russia in the US internal narrative, but also the importance of US-Russia relations globally. You have mentioned also the expectations about the summit. And then from the Russian perspectives, you spoke about its relations with the new US administration and implications of this for the regional context, be it Europe or, as you said, Syria, for instance. So we can say that both speakers mentioned that we shouldn't have too high expectations about this meeting. However, we still, this dialogue can still have positive implications for international security by providing incentive for de-escalation. So now I would like to open up for your questions. We will take a group of questions, 3 questions at once. You can raise your hand. I see already 2 hands, or you can also use your chat. So I will first, I see the 2 questions now, Ricardo and Martina Fuchs. Please, Ricardo, go first.
Well, if Martina wants to start, ladies first.
Go ahead, Ricardo, it's fine.
Okay. My name is Ricardo Bagnato. I'm a journalist of Swiss Public Television. Thank you very much for this invitation. And one very short question. I know you all don't have the agenda in your pocket, the agenda that you're talking about, but what would you say? What would be the major arguments, major topics they would talk about? There are so many pandemic, I would say human rights, whatever. Mr. President Joe Biden already said that he would push on the human rights argument, but nevertheless, what would you think would be the agenda, if you might share it? And just a doubt, this is a very important table around, we have Russia and United States, but since I would say in the last 20 years, there's one major role of China. She's absent. I mean, that's really an absence that screams aloud. I don't know how to say that, because Russia and the United States takes part of the old-fashioned world of the World War. Now everything has changed. Would China just stay on the balcony and see? And so the question, what is the problem with China for United States? What is the problem with China for Russia?
Thank you, Ricardo. Martina, please.
Thank you so much, everybody, for this great discussion and very timely opportunity as well. I would like to ask Thomas Greminger. Thomas, it's great to see you again. For everybody else, my name is Martina. I work for China Xinhua News Agency, but I have a question on Europe. Thomas, what do you think will be the repercussions and implications for Europe from this summit? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Martina. I suggest, Mahmoud, would you like to start? And then Thomas can also reply on the second question at the same time.
Thank you, Sasha. I'll be happy to. Thank you, Ricardo, for your question. I think if we try to imagine the 2 set of advisors talking to each other and saying, and trying to, of course, agree some sort of agenda, I would see the following. I think that in such encounters, one usually moves on the basis of those issues that are less divisive, that are more generic, and therefore are more amenable to some sort of entry point conversation, rather than going with those elements which every side knows will start a complex and difficult discussion. So you don't want to start, as you can imagine, a conversation where your counterpart will immediately sort of have those things they've been eagerly waiting to sort of test you with as such. And so in such conversations, I could imagine that either the pandemic or the nuclear issues would be first on the table, in the sense that the nuclear issues are part of an ongoing conversation which has depth, which has essentially a consensus. There's different aspects of the different treaties and so on. And it's certainly a kind of it's an operational conversation. It's a conversation that could be a natural entry point as it is. The pandemic then, I would say, and they're interchangeable, could also start with that, given its urgency, is also something that could be one first element to start with. Possibly, actually, I would say logically the first element, since it's out there, countries are dealing with it, and there's matters of cooperation and as well competition in terms of the markets, in terms of the different vaccines and circulation of all of these elements. So I think these 2 elements could be logical entry points. I think a third one maybe could turn to then, maybe you could imagine a line item there on the agenda on regional issues, which could be kind of a coded term for Syria and other places, where they have things to engage with, and gradually actually moving towards either potentially a division or disagreement rather, or agreement for that matter. But I would not certainly see human rights as the first item at 9 a.m. that day, for sure. China, you're absolutely right. It's clearly the elephant in the room. there. I don't think it's absent. I think it's absent present. I think it's absolutely inevitable. And what is the problem with China for both sides? Well, it's competitive nature, it's efficient nature, it's global power nature. It's that simple. China is the other big global superpower in this, and it has been sort of giving a run, quote unquote, for their money for both sides in that sense. And so I think that and to Europe, of course. And so I think China will be addressed at every step of the way, whether directly in those conversations or indirectly. And so I certainly do not see it as absent in that sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Thomas.
Yeah, perhaps starting with Ricardo's questions, nothing to add on what Mahmoud just said on China. When it comes to the agenda, I also agree with Mahmoud's comments. I would add, though, that the agenda will necessarily need to be broad. Why? There are very different expectations, and the presidents will have to serve both expectations of domestic audiences as well as diplomatic purposes. So you will have in the agenda setting, I think there is a portion of public diplomacy and a portion of perhaps more traditional diplomacy. And so human rights in Russia, but also human rights in the United States will certainly figure, that no doubt about it. Also tricky regional issues will figure, trickier than perhaps Syria. I'm sure Belarus will be addressed. But then I would expect, if they indeed, want to focus on those issues where interests obviously converge, where perhaps cooperation is also possible, then I would expect them to then dig deeper on issues like strategic stability, clearly on climate change and environmental issues. I mentioned some of these issues where I do see a potential for, let's say, selective cooperation. To Martina's question, well, I think discussions between the United States and the Russian Federation on strategic stability have a huge impact on Europe in terms of security, and in that sense, and I also alluded, there is the strategic weapons, the nuclear weapons issue, but at the end, I think if there is a constructive tone at the summit, this might also then give a positive impulse to deal more with conventional issues. I mentioned military risk reduction, and clearly this would be quite urgent. And so in that sense, this has an important bearing also on Europe, even if Europe is not sitting at the table. And then, of course, I think Europe also expects its ally to send out a number of messages.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We have two more questions. I will read one from the chat, and then I will give the floor to Paula Dupras-Dobias. She would like to ask a question directly. So first, the question from the chat. From Andres Almon, the US is back, but is the Western Bloc back? Can Biden count 100% on European support, and in which way? That's the first question. I believe it is for both speakers. And now, Paula, would you like to take the floor to ask your question?
Yes. Hello. Good morning. Yes. My question is actually, it goes a little bit beyond. It's a wider issue that goes beyond the issues that are on the table at the talks. namely the implications for the humanitarian world. And by coming to Geneva, the hub for humanitarian activity, what do you expect, the implications could be given the vaccine diplomacy that we've seen, not only from China, but also from Russia in certain parts of the world, and whether, in talks on the pandemic, whether there may be, or otherwise on conflict as well, whether there may be, you may see a growing role of either parties on these issues.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thomas, would you like to start? Can I just ask you to move your mic a little bit, maybe further and up, like this we can hear you better, because sometimes there are some problems with the sound. Thank you.
Okay. Well, on the issues that Paula referred to, I would hope, that the summit also sends a signal not only toward bilateral global problem solving, but towards strengthening again multilateral institutions. And I think it's important that we would move away from this unilateral transactional approaches that we have seen in recent years, that we have also seen at least partly dominate the international community's response to the pandemic. And here, obviously, the tone set by the two leaders in terms of strengthening multilateral institutions is very important. I'm confident that we will hear something in that direction, and hopefully, this could then also gradually lead to a paradigm shift away from transactionalism again into multilateral, cooperative, global problem solving. And from a more, security policy perspective, I would also hope that this would allow to again strengthen the concept of cooperative security. On the first question, I think Mahmoud has alluded to it. I think President Biden's policies towards Europe differ quite radically from his predecessors, and in that sense, I would perceive a much stronger unity now. But then again, I'm not so sure that we really want to see again these blocks. I think what we want to see is global problems being addressed and eventually solved. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Mahmoud?
Thank you very much. So to Andres' question, I think that there's two questions there. One is the support, and the second is on whether the bloc itself has somehow come back together. On the support, I think that by and large, yes, President Biden could certainly count on the Western support, or at least the key voices in that support. Germany, France. The UK is a special case. Systemically, of course, the support is there. Individually, the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom had aligned himself too much with President Trump, and that is an issue that had particularly peeved the current US president. So you could expect a little bit of coldness then, but the gentlemen are professionals. The countries have this deep and long association, so I don't expect too much of that rift to deepen in that sense. I believe someone has their mic open. So that is one of the issues on which one could certainly count on that support. We could also mention, by the way, the fact that institutional support, wider, I'm thinking about NATO, for instance, which has certainly been waiting to express a different dynamic vis-a-vis the United States. So I think he will certainly come with that momentum with him as it is. The other question is the other side of the question is interesting, actually. And I am not sure whether we can see and whether we could, to Thomas's point, desire such unity. If there's a Western bloc, I'm thinking against whom? Certainly this becomes an issue for Russia, but I'm thinking other parts of the world. I think the whole notion of blocs around the world is also something that at times could be negative, a negative tendency when we're thinking globally of these issues. But whether it means a certain cementing of Europe's position on these issues, that I see some of that happening more now than in the previous phase. We should remind ourselves that Europe was united against Trump's excesses, for sure, during those years. Paula, thank you very much for raising this question. It is absolutely central. And I would say the following very briefly. One, I think there's a leadership gap on these issues. They're very real, they're very new. There is not much seriously that has been seen in terms of leadership. Certainly WHO has not been leading on this or has been leading poorly. Certainly many of these countries have been themselves in a diplomacy of contest as opposed to a diplomacy of cooperation. We've seen far too much surveillance, intrusive issues. We have seen human rights issues in many of the legislations that have been adopted or are being adopted, including here in Switzerland, on these issues. So I think that those elements are raising large questions that need to be addressed through a deeper reflection about how we react to this. It raises, in fact, human rights and humanitarian issues for that matter. I think the pressure here would come by being in Geneva, to your point, and having this milieu in this humanitarian community, in the civil society, in these professionals that work day in, day out on these issues. I think somehow that hopefully will kind of suffuse that conversation and hopefully lead it to consider wider issues. The global south is missing. There is very little cooperation. There's very little support on these questions, which are historical challenges for humanity. And so to see everyone sort of racing to their particular protectionism and being very defensive on contractual matters, I think is no exemplarity to beam internationally on these issues. So hopefully some of these issues will make it to that conversation, at least thematically, and by virtue of being in Geneva.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, and thank you again to Paula for this question that brings us back to Geneva. There is one more question from Christophe Bernet about also the role of Geneva and more largely the role of Switzerland. In what way can Switzerland as the host country of the Geneva Summit profit from this meeting? Will its relationship to either the US or Russia change in the short term, or is there a long-term profit from Switzerland's long-standing tradition as host country of high-level peace talks, multilateral and bilateral meetings? And which other countries are Switzerland's biggest competitors in that regard? That's on the first question. And then we are coming back to the Biden administration. A question coming from Barbara Bibo. How will the Biden administration's policies approaches towards Russia differ from Trump's? Mahmoud already mentioned that, but maybe you can develop a little bit more. Could you offer a retrospective and be more specific about the two different approaches? I will ask the third question at the same time. It just arrived from Andres again. There is a hope of the escalation, but is there a risk that this summit is more about displaying power, precisely because they are both weak at home? Thank you very much. I suggest this time, Mahmoud, that you go first, if it's fine with you.
Thank you very much. So to Barbara's question, thank you very much for pushing on that. I think it's central to the matter. I think building up on what I said earlier, and I forgot to mention, in fact, that we've had a very serious matter, of course, which is the New York Times June 2020 revelations of accusations to Russian secret military units allegedly putting a bounty on US soldiers in Afghanistan, which President Trump had been accused for responding to very weakly, if not ignoring them. There's the matter of the National Intelligence Council of March 2020, which speaks of direct threats to the election of last year, not the 2016 one as it is. So this is the sort of the milieu in which this is coming. So what specifically would be different in the approach? Well, clearly what we saw during the Trump administration is a personal relationship to President Putin and behind him, Russia. That was problematic for the United States of America and for the presidency itself, which was seen to be put secondarily to those personal interests. Of course, this was a theme throughout the presidency of Mr. Trump, and there was no contradiction in the manner in which he went about that. But what it meant for the United States is that its relationship with a foreign power, with a foreign entity, and this was the heart of the investigation, was now becoming sort of problematic because of who sat in the White House. It's literally unprecedented historically in that sense. You might have had, relationship and friendships. The Bush family has for many, many years had a personal and a friendship with the Saud family, for instance. But the issue of state on state had been put on the back burner. I expect Mr. Biden, as he has said consistently, to put that issue in a reverse order, to say that this is a relationship between a state and another one, and he comes secondarily to this, and therefore the interest of the United States, however he defines them, have to be dealt with in that sense. And therefore, secondarily, a red line, we spoke of those in terms of what could be expected, rather accepted from Russia or not, and interference would be a red line. Mr. Trump never addressed the matter of interference, whether in the elections, whether on foreign issues, and so on and so forth, because he did not see that as a problem. And one could clearly, objectively say that he had a personal interest in that friendship, as he himself repeatedly gave signs to that. I think that is the heart of the matter. You could say that it's almost behavioral, but I see also in it a political stance in putting the relationship on state to state. I should say one final thing that I think is both limitative and empowering to President Biden. I think President Biden is a domestic president. I think he's really ultimately not too much interested in the international arena. He'll have that meeting. He'll send those messages. He'll have that conversation, I think. But I think he's got his eye on really dealing and addressing and solving the pandemic issue. He's a post-1929 major crisis in the United States kind of president. He wants that as his legacy. That's what he has his eye on. He may possibly only have one term given his age, right? And that is, I think, where the main issue for him would be in terms of that. So I don't expect him to have such adventurism or a long, complex kind of fight, quote unquote, with Russia on many, many issues in that sense. I think that is also something that will make it that he would have less time, I would say, for these issues, and possibly a disposition to find some sort of modus vivendi on some of these crises. Syria comes to mind. And that's not good news for President Assad, for that matter, because that means they will find some sort of agreement space for that. On Switzerland, I will leave that to Thomas. And I think that essentially those are the points that I wanted to cover. Yes, to Andres's point, yes, absolutely. De-escalation is a bet because if there's too much bravado, if there's too much power on both sides, we spoke of Biden's desire to send that message and Putin's traditional showmanship. I think this can come also to a clash, and you're right in pointing that out.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Very insightful. Thomas, would you like to develop more on the role of Switzerland?
Well, on Christoph Bernet's question, I would argue, well, let's not have unrealistic expectations in the short term. As we hear, there will be a meeting between President Biden and President Parmelin, and this is also good so, and I'm sure President Parmelin will seize the opportunity and flag a few issues that are currently on the Swiss-US agenda, but there will clearly be no time to dig deeper, and so again, I would caution expectations in that sense. In the longer term, I would say these kinds of hosting summits, Swiss contributions, Swiss good offices, but also Swiss contributions to peace and stability. I think they give access. They give access to key players and allow the Swiss authorities to present their arguments. It does not necessarily mean that it is then much easier to kind of make sure that their interests are accepted by the other side, but at least this access for dialogue, I think this is an advantage in the long term. And then I would also argue that Switzerland is clearly a country that takes advantage from globalization, and there is an expectation that Switzerland would also contribute to global problem solving. In that sense, offering Switzerland as a venue for this kind of meeting is a Swiss contribution to this. It's part of global burden sharing, and I think that's also an important aspect that I would mention. Perhaps on Andre's question, I think the fact that both presidents face huge domestic challenges provides a strong incentive for both of them to conduct foreign policies that are less costly and to prevent future arms races. So that, I would argue, nurtures our hope for de-escalation. At the same time, as I said before, home audiences in both countries expect assertive, perhaps even harsh statements. So I think the trick will be to differentiate between some very assertive public diplomacy statements while maintaining the space for constructive dialogue and eventually also cooperation on selected issues of mutual interest.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I see that we have 1 minute left, so I suggest to I'll take the last question as Jean-Philippe is waiting for since the last round. Jean-Philippe, may I ask you to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe Chaler from the Swiss TV, Radio Télévision Suisse. This is a question for Mahmoud. You mentioned that both presidents are weak at home. But would you say that Biden is maybe the weaker because democracies are in decline as we see the rise of authoritarianism in Russia, China, India, Turkey, and the threat of populism into democracies like Hungary, Poland, and we'll see what happens in France next year. So maybe Biden has the more to lose.
May I, Alexandra?
Please go ahead, Mahmoud.
Thank you very much. Jean-Philippe, absolutely, I completely agree. I think that the challenges that are not to be discounted for President Putin, there's a change, there's some tensions, there's a repositioning within the system, there's a perennial issue of the oligarchs having to be dealt with, all of these. But these are issues that he's familiar with and he has been planning for, in fact, proactively with the constitutional changes a year or two, if you recall, as it is. Whereas for Biden, I think it's a combination of things. I think it's one of the lowest point in terms of the crisis within the United States per se in its history. This is building up for many, many years. It's not just the past year on the racial tension. It comes for several years as it is. The authoritarianism of Mr. Trump himself and what he did to the system, which is still reeling from that. This is also a challenge. The larger question of the democracy crisis, which builds in now into all democracies, North and South, Europe, the United States. And I think you're absolutely right, because this is a fundamental issue which connects with Mr. Putin indeed, which is this kind of global empire strikes back dynamic of neo-authoritarianism, which we see from Saudi Arabia to parts of Europe to Russia, to the United States in its own way, in the manner it deals with its citizenry as it is, and of course Brazil, and so on and so forth. There is this high moment where the vector democracy and justice is really eaten away at. And I think for a democracy, which the United States is still as a republic, it is certainly objectively more of a challenge to deal with this, and add on that the geopolitics of this encounter. I would certainly agree with that analysis.
Mahmoud, thank you very much. We have covered a lot of issues, a lot of ground during this 1 hour only. We discussed the possible agenda, the domestic challenges in the both countries, the relations between Russia and the US, its implications for different regions. We moved the focus to humanitarian aspects. That was a very interesting discussion. And of course, the role of Switzerland. On this, I would like to thank our speakers for their insights and for their honesty and their openness to answer all your questions. Please join me in a round of virtual applause. I'm also grateful to our audience from different media outlets for their questions and their active participation. We hope to see you in our future events, and I wish you a very nice day. Thank you and goodbye.